somehow I've been playing this Curtis Mayfield song over and over and over in my head. It's all right, because I've been trying to tell myself over the past 60 days it's all right. Some days I think it is, some days I wonder. We speak of the brand new administration of the President Donald J. Trump, and I have no better person to discuss this with. I really am blessed doing this show than David Andelman, our friend, who will give us his best impressions, and I can't wait for this. David, how are you this evening, my friend?
I'm well, but I don't really do a very good Donald Trump impression, I have to tell you.
Well, we're going to do a big league interview. How about that?
There you go.
What happened this past Friday?
Well, my expertise, I really follow Donald Trump most closely on international stuff, but I've been paying pretty close attention also to the healthcare debate. What happened was Trump couldn't get it done. He's supposedly the great closer and so on, but he just doesn't understand. There's a very different. It's very different closing a real estate transaction than it is, persuading 435 representatives or a majority of to vote for something that they don't particularly really want to do. The same is true. He discovered earlier in the week with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. You can't necessarily take a world leader and force something down their throat. None of this works. It frankly didn't work all that well in some of his real estate deals. What most people fail to understand is that Trump, even in his real estate transaction, which is the art of the deal, he said he was prepared to walk away from the table. When he walked away from the table, he declared bankruptcy. The deal failed. The banks refused to continue to lend him money, and you can't do that when you're talking about the United States. And we're talking about him trying to transform basically 1/5 of the entire American economy, namely our healthcare system, in 17 days. It's ridiculous. It just can't possibly happen.
It's an amazing thing to me. Now, the commentary that I was listening to today, more than one person was saying everything coming behind that: border control, tax reform, infrastructure, all of the things, the building of jobs domestically, all of that has suffered a serious hit because of what happened last Friday. Is that a true perspective in your estimation?
Well, it is. I mean, obviously things would have gone more easily if they've gotten the health care plan through. But one thing you have to understand is getting it through the House is still not getting it passed into law. And frankly, I think getting it through the Senate would have been really dramatically more difficult than getting it through the House. I frankly don't think it could have. I think it would have died in the Senate, whatever. But what they needed that bill, you see, for the $1 trillion in tax savings over the next 10 years, that would have enabled them to do a substantial tax cut. Now what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to do a piecemeal tax cut, bits and pieces at the edge, and it's not going to be the dramatic tax cut that Trump was hoping for. At the same time, he may not have enough left over from the revenues of the tax after the tax cut to do the major infrastructure program he was talking about, or build his wall in Mexico. So it all begins to spiral out of control. I mean, there were people today who basically said, after 2 months, he's a failed president. Now, I don't think that's the case, but I think he is certainly not the power that he envisioned, or many of his followers envisioned, when he first came into office.
It's an absolutely, it's I mean it.
But frankly, I think the most dangerous thing of it all is how foreign leaders are going to look at him.
Yeah.
Basically, they're going to look at him as a 4-year lame duck president that you can't really do business with and who doesn't understand any of most of the concepts that they're peddling anyway overseas. So that's very dangerous. You know, is Kim Jong-un the crazy little fat dictator in Korea, North Korea? Is he going to suddenly say, "Gee, you know, I can basically do anything I want because no one's going to back up this madman Trump, and there's no way he can muster the strength to come after me." There's all sorts of potential fallout from this that's very frightening.
I've noticed the financial markets have strung together a number of down days. I've spoke today to a very good friend who is a Bank of America vice president in money management, and he is saying the prevailing wisdom there is we really don't know what's going to happen, and boy, that gives me a great feeling of confidence.
Well, that's true to a degree. I mean, these down markets haven't been plummeting. There's been a gentle slide. You know, we're not talking about any 300-400 point drops in one day as a result of this. Markets are just kind of taking a pause, I think, at this point, and that's not all bad. You know, we've had such a run up that it was really hard to see how that could be sustained for any length of time, in my view. Overseas, some of the markets they've had a couple of bad, you know, not mildly bad days, but for the most part, they're holding up as well. This is not a global crisis that's been touched off yet. So, you know, I'm not panicking in the markets, and there's no panic out there. So the markets are, to some degree, a barometer of the temperature of the country. But it's not a real barometer of the success or failure of an entire presidential administration. Now, his ability to get something done in Congress, something substantial, that is a test of a presidential administration, and so far he's not passing it.
Do you feel that the looming budget shutdown is probably his next major test, and what fallout may result from that possibly could make things better for him or make it a whole lot worse?
Well, I think that is a test. There's no doubt about that. But I think the Republicans have been, you know, sufficiently chastised by the reaction to not somehow managing to repeal and replace Obamacare that they're not going to be able. They just can't afford politically to let the country, the government shut down.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to pass that through. I think that shouldn't be a problem, and they don't need any kind of supermajority to do it. You know, the question there is going to be a test to see if the Freedom Caucus, the right wing, extreme right wing, is prepared to understands what they're doing to the image of the entire Republican Party in this country, and that will be to a degree a test of how rational they are. I'm not sure that's really going to be a test of Trump. That's much more of a congressional issue, and I hope that Paul Ryan can manage to pull it off.
It certainly would be interesting. One of the things I had heard this morning is the Trump administration was reaching out to moderate Democrats trying to get to a common ground, and I'm thinking, well, maybe this is a good thing. I mean, we shall see.
Yep, absolutely.
Since your area and what you've been studying most is international affairs, I'm curious to get your impressions of the performance thus far of RexTillerson.
Well, I'm a little disappointed in RexTillerson, I have to tell you, but I'm not totally surprised. My sense is that Tillerson does not have a sort of a grand vision of how he wants the world to develop. Henry Kissinger used to call it a Weltanschauung. And frankly, any president or any, Secretary of State who doesn't have a very clear vision of where he wants to go, where he wants the world to go, is not going to be very effective in doing his job. And frankly, at this point, Tillerson's principal contributions, and he sees his contributions, confined to a whole series of big whiteboards that he's had brought into his the Secretary of State's offices on the 7th floor of the State Department. And he's diagramming the entire State Department. So he's trying to make it more efficient. He said this is what he did at Exxon. Well, you don't have to diagram the State Department. The State Department is a bureaucracy, and it's always existed that way, and it works relatively effectively for what it needs. Mm-hmm. What you need is a vision of where America should be going internationally. And that's not something you can diagram on a whiteboard. That's something you really have to have a sense of. And you have to be willing to talk to and negotiate with, on a whole range of issues, with other world leaders who have their own priorities. It's very different from running a global oil company. And I hope he eventually or very quickly gets to understand that. Because if he doesn't, and at the same time, if Trump doesn't understand the value of soft diplomacy, such as foreign aid and so on, which, by the way, Tillerson has, tried to put a stake through the heart of. When he was in South Korea, he was saying, basically addressed to North Koreans, this is the end of soft diplomacy. From now on, you're going to feel our, hard diplomacy. Well, even the military recognizes that you can't necessarily solve every world problem by sending in the 82nd Airborne. Every problem is, if all you have is a hammer, the only thing you're going to be able to do is pound nails. And my fear is that that's the direction that Tillerson could be taking the country. Now, I have a lot more hope that McMaster, who was actually in the White House, the General McMaster, National Security Advisor, may be able to have more of an influence on the direction of foreign policy than Tillerson, because right now I'm not very optimistic about Tillerson's grasp of some of the issues.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting. I often think of the first cabinet that George W. Bush picked out, coming out of the box, and I kind of shook my head, and I'm starting to get vestiges of that with this group of people.
Well, no, I agree, and I think not all of them are going to be around in 6 months, frankly, or 8 months, or a year. Mm-hmm. Look, Steve Bannon, for instance, who has managed to talk himself onto the National Security Council as well as into the innermost recesses of the White House, is not someone who's ever ran any kind of a political operation before, and they have really no concept of what it means to succeed, how to succeed in corralling 218 very individualistic congressmen into their point of view. Tillerson tried the other day Bannon tried the other day to do this by saying to the Freedom Caucus when they came calling at the White House, you are all going to support, our health care bill, and that's simply it. There's no discussion. One of the members of the Freedom Caucus says, he said, my father told me about the same thing when I was 18 years old. He said, and that didn't work for me then. So I think he doesn't understand that you can't dictate. Sean Spicer actually had it right the other day at one of his daily press briefing when he said, we can't order congressmen how to vote. He said, this is not a dictatorship. Well, thank goodness there's someone in the White House who recognizes that.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. And I haven't been an ardent observer of the press briefings, but when they run, if I'm watching the Bloomberg stream, I'll stop and watch. They don't seem to be happy affairs. And I know that sounds horribly simplistic, but it seems like it just seems like a very tough, intense environment. Have you heard anything from any of the press corps?
Well, yeah, I talked to some of them, and I watch the briefings every day. Look, the press briefings are always some degree an adversarial affair. Mm-hmm. They're probably more so in this White House simply because they've treated some reporters so badly, and Trump himself has treated the press so badly and considered them the enemy. I would say for the last 8 years, Obama didn't consider them the enemy, but there were a lot of times when they were not on all that great terms. Obama seemed to think that the press very often had its own agenda, which was very different from his agenda. Now, that's in no means the same as calling the press the enemy of the people or fake news,
or fake news,
all that sort of thing. So
Yeah, no, certainly not. Wanted to speak to you a little bit about Russia, and it seems to me, in my naivete and ignorance, not even arguably, that whenever a tie is mentioned to Russia coming from the Trump administration, it's like almost as if somebody in grade school had cooties and it was this horrible thing. And one day I was driving down the road and I thought, well, for years we had the Soviet Union and they were communists, and we wanted them to see the light and we wanted them to see freedom. And over the course of time, they became a democracy, okay, of sorts. And now it kind of gets to where people get upset with that. And I can't make heads or tails of this thing. Can you help me?
Well, in terms of whether Russia is a democracy?
Yeah, exactly. Or should we be trading with them? Are they, it's... they're not communists anymore.
They're not, but they're not democracy in the Western sense. It very much they're democracy in the Russian sense. And you have to understand. I tell people a lot of this when they don't really seem to understand Russia all that well.
Mm-hmm.
But Russians have been ruled by autocrats back to the time of Ivan the Terrible. They've always thrived under a strong ruler. When they have not thrived is under a weak ruler. Just as an example, Boris Yeltsin was a weak ruler. He was a drunk. He was,
I remember.
Playboy in his own way. I mean, he just was not the kind of leader that the Russians needed. And the result was that the Russian economy all but completely fell apart. The streets were just filled with derelicts and panhandlers and drunk all over the place. It was just not a very pleasant place to live. Putin has shaped that up quite a lot. So to say, he's a dictator, yes, he is to a degree, but he's a Russian-style dictator. And we have to understand that a lot of the Russians really do still very much want that kind of a person as their leader. So we shouldn't just dismiss him and say, this is a dictator that we're going to have to somehow, convert to our form of democracy. Our form of democracy isn't going to work in every country.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And as you say, for years and years and years, they've always been a dictatorship.
I mean, our kind of democracy doesn't work in Israel, which is supposed to be the only democratic country, between Greece and India. It's a very different kind of democracy. There are like 24 different political parties in parliament. We couldn't begin to. Can you imagine having that kind of a representational system in our Congress? We'd never get anything done.
We can't get two.
But they've come to that has worked for Israel since 1948. So you have to say it's working to a degree. It's a different kind of democracy than now. It's just more of a consensus democracy, if you will.
And I'm happy you brought up Israel. The recent dealings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and how the White House has made overtures, and positive, negative, will it last? Is it good? Is it deficient?
Well, what's interesting is you'll notice that the Israelis are no longer pushing very hard for Trump to rip up the Iran treaty, which is one of his other more ridiculous campaign promises.
Nefarious campaign promises, yes.
Rip it up and negotiate a better one. But, Netanyahu and some of his generals came to Netanyahu and said, look, you don't want to do that right now because the consequences are something that we can't handle. We are not in a position to be able to militarily, by airstrikes, take out the Iranian nuclear capability that will immediately begin to come to life if the Iran treaty is ripped up. And they recognize this. The generals in Israel recognize this. They would need American-type bunker buster bombs, they're called, very deep penetration bombs, that we are not going to let them have, the Israelis. And the U.S. is not going to be in the position anytime in the foreseeable future of trying to attack, make war on Iran. So the Israelis were very happy to kind of let the status quo continue for quite a while and see how it plays out, which is very wise. But this was, what people tell me is, this was when Netanyahu came and visited Trump a few weeks ago. That was one of his messages: leave the Iran treaty alone.
Incredibly interesting, and
I wrote one of my columns for CNN Opinion, which I'm writing now on that subject. It got some attention.
Yeah, no doubt. In our closing moments together, I'd like to talk about Great Britain, the affairs of last week, the future of Brexit, and the future of Europe, and the stability of the economy in that region. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I think Europe is quite stable. In fact, it's interesting. The euro is become a much stronger currency in the last couple of months than the dollar has, for instance. And that's good and bad. I think for the moment, Europe is going to hang together. I think it's going to be very interesting to see the results of the French elections. I'm going over there in about 3 weeks to cover the French presidential elections, and I'll be there also 2 months later for the French parliamentary elections. And the German elections, where Angela Merkel is seeking a 4th term as chancellor, those are really going to set the tone for Europe going forward. I happen to be very optimistic about that. I just don't think that the French or the Germans are going to be willing to put their countries, which they love deeply, in the hands of some crazy right-wing Trump-style people, because they have seen what has happened already when you have a Trump-type president or leader in charge of our country. So in some respects, that's what Marine Le Pen in France is running against. She thought she'd be running with Trump. She's really, in effect, running against him, because that is the last thing that the French want to see, is that kind of chaos in
France. Well, it's fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Our guest, the esteemed David Andelman.
And I would add, before we sign off, I would encourage everybody to follow me on Twitter. It's @David Andelman, all one word.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll find interesting things on there every day from me. And my last book, Shattered Peace, which I think really kind of sets the tone for
Now, I'm glad you brought that up. You've done an update to that, haven't you?
I did. I did a centenary edition that is updated. Sir Harold Evans, the longtime editor-in-chief of the Sunday Times of London, and then of the New York Daily News, has written a marvelous foreword for it. So it's a very interesting new edition. It's just out.
Well, David, thanks once again, and I'm sure we'll be talking in a matter of a couple of months, and God only knows what the subjects will be, but I'm sure they'll be interesting. You continue to be...
I like to say that Donald Trump has had one very favorable result for American journalists. He is full employment for American journalists. Never one for something to write about.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Thank you, my friend. Take care, and we'll be talking soon.
I'll look forward to that. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David. That is the esteemed David Andelman, former editor emeritus of the World Policy Journal. We're going to be coming right back to close here. Quite a wild show it's been on Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast.
It's not the pale moon that excites me, that thrills and delights me. Oh no, it's just the news.